Hi guys, this is Robin. Welcome to my history class, History with Robin. We're going to be talking a little bit more about a few things from the Revolutionary War, a little bit of the aftermath of that, the things that came afterwards, and then we'll move on to our next subject. Hi guys, glad you guys could join me. Akanksha, I hope I said your name right. Happy birthday. I'm glad you really love history. Hi, everybody. Okay, so just as a reminder, I know many of you have been here before, but just if you have a question, we don't have the raise your hand option, so just type it into the Q&A box and I will try to answer it. Isaiah, my costume, I'm trying to be Thomas Jefferson, and I don't think Thomas Jefferson would have maybe had quite a frilly neck thing, but it was the best I could do. So we are going to talk a little bit about George Washington. We're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, and we're going to talk about a couple of other things. Hi, Denali and Mackenzie. Glad you guys could be here. I am pretending to be Thomas Jefferson today. Great. Hi, everybody who's joined me. Okay, good. I think we are going to get started. So I'm going to share my slideshow with you. Okay, so this part that we are starting is a part about Westward Expansion, talking about the expansion of the United States to the West. Lorna, it is not a decorative curtain. It's kind of like a decorative shoulder thing, but it definitely looks like a curtain. I would agree. That's so cool about your mom having the common sense book that we talked about last time. Okay, so did I go too far? I did not go too far. Okay, so where we left off was in about 1789. And so the United States adopted something called the Constitution. And America was now ready to test out its new government. But first, they needed to have an election to decide who would be running that government. So soon the Congress, which remember, or if you don't know, is the part of the government which makes the laws, and they represent the people in the states that they're from. So pretty soon the Congress had its members to represent its people and make its laws that they wanted. And the US was what we call a republic, a representative democracy, which was like ancient Rome, where the citizens themselves chose people to represent them in the lawmaking. And that is different than a direct democracy, which is where everyone gets to vote on the law, like ancient Greece. But unlike Rome, the US also had a president. Anybody know who he was? If you said George Washington, you are correct. You are right. George Washington was the first president. People liked him a lot. For one thing, he was the general who won the war, so that made him very popular. And another thing was that he did something that is very, very rare in history. After winning the revolution, he actually turned over his army to the government and he retired. So if you've studied history and revolutions, you might know that almost always after the revolution is won, the winning general uses his army to make himself a king and to rule the new country by force. So this idea that George Washington had to retire and turn over his army to the government was a brand new idea. But not George Washington. He really believed in the ideas that he'd fought for. Freedom for people to govern themselves and not having to be governed or ruled by force, not being told what they had to do and then having the rules forced on them. He actually didn't even want to be president. He felt he'd already done his duty, he'd done his job, he'd won freedom for the colonies, and it was time to retire. But the new colonies elected him as president. And so he agreed. He wanted to help. So once he was elected, he agreed. And people all over the world were watching this new country, the United States of America, very carefully, because they wanted to know, would this new president, would George Washington, would he turn out to be like a king and just take over? And at the time, if you studied history, you would believe that that was going to be the case, that that was what that was what he was going to do. Yes, that is a picture of George Washington as the king. It's kind of that's not a real picture, but it was a picture that someone made to make him look like he would be the king. Because a lot of people, including the King of England, George III, believed that that was what was going to happen, that they wouldn't be able to have this president who wouldn't take a bunch of power. But George Washington, he made a new chapter of history. And he actually did his job following the new Constitution, which are the rules and laws of how the country is going to be won. So this meant his job and his power was really limited. He didn't have a huge amount of power. He appointed the judges of the US Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court is maybe the most important court in all of the United States, and its main job is to decide if laws or things that happen follow the Constitution. So it's really important. And the president has the power to appoint who he wants to do that job. Now, does that mean that he had power over them? No, because after appointing them, he didn't have the power to fire them. He wasn't their boss. And they could judge their cases and laws without his interference. So that was a way. Yeah, that picture does kind of look weird. Those are the men who were on the Supreme Court. But that's just a picture showing that. Isaiah, yes, you are so noticeable. That is Newt Scamander's costume from Virtual Spirit Day. If you guys have watched webinars with somebody who's dressed up as Newt Scamander, that's my husband, James. And so I stole his costume to try to be Thomas Jefferson. So as president, George Washington had the power of commander of chief of the Army and Navy. Now, it may sound like it's a very serious job and he might have a lot of power, and he would if he were the king of America. But because he was a president, unless there was an emergency where he needed to stop a sudden attack, he couldn't make the Army or Navy fight for him unless the Congress, so those are the men who make the laws, voted on a declaration of war against that country. So instead of saying, oh, that country is my enemy and I'm going to send all the Army and Navy to fight them, he had to get permission or agreement from the Congress in order to do that. And so he actually they never did a declaration of war while he was president. And that power was one that was also limited by the Congress. Hi, Anjali. Good, I'm glad to see that's you. Let's see, did George have his face on a dollar bill? And if why a dollar bill? He does have his face on the dollar bill. I think, though I don't know for sure, because it's probably the most used dollar. And I think it might have something to do with that he was the #1 president. Elia, what a great question about how many judges were there on the Supreme Court, and is it the same amount as the first set? I really don't know. What I do know is that the Constitution tells us the rules of the way that the Supreme Court works, but I'm not actually sure if it sets the number of judges. That would be a great research. This picture, Lorna, great question. This is just the army, them fighting with the army. Caleb, thank you. There are 9. Thank you for coming to my rescue and answering that question for me. Noah, thank you for joining us. We're talking a little bit about George Washington in the beginning of the United States, and then we're going to be talking about the next president too. So here's another power. This is a little bit more about George Washington and his power. So when it came to making laws as president, Washington, he had little power. He didn't have a lot of power. So it was Congress's job. They made the laws, and President Washington's job was to sign them, but only if he agreed with them. So if all of Congress agreed that they wanted a law, and then President Washington received it and he agreed with it, he would sign it. But if he didn't sign it, if he didn't agree with it, he could do something called veto it, where he basically is saying no to it. That's what it means when you veto a law. He doesn't sign it and he says he doesn't want it to be a law, and it wouldn't become a law. And now that might sound like that's a lot of power, but with enough extra votes, Congress could make the law count anyway. So if the president says he doesn't want to have something be a law, it actually goes back to the Congress. And if they get a certain amount of the people in the Congress to say they still want it, they can still make it a law. And that's one of the ways that the different powers in the government can balance each other. So it's not just one person with all the power, which, since we've been talking about people being worried that the president would turn into a king, that kind of makes sense why they would want to divide it up that way. And so if Congress did that, then he had no choice. The president had no choice. If they got enough people to say, actually, we want this to be a law, he had to enforce that law. See, you guys have a lot of great questions. Yes, that is a painting. Lorna, great question. That's a painting. Was George Washington the first president? Yes, he was in fact the first president. Lorna, I agree, being president sounds confusing. There's lots of different laws, but if you read the Constitution and you kind of work it out, it's not as confusing as it sounds, but there are a lot of things that you have to do. Anjali, no, the next president wasn't Abraham Lincoln. It was Thomas Jefferson, who we are going to talk about. It actually wasn't Thomas Jefferson, sorry. It was another man, John Adams. But then we're not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about the next president. Kiosha, I know it sounds unfair that the Congress can sort of get enough votes to pass the law anyway, but it was just a way to make sure that the President of the United States wouldn't unfairly himself stop something, stop a law that he didn't want it. So hopefully that's the purpose of it, and I would hope that that's the way that it would go. So carrying out laws, sorry, just one second, guys, so sorry. Carrying out laws, enforcing laws, and organizing people to do that was actually the president's main job. And he did his job as well as he could, and he never tried to become powerful like a king. After serving his first 4-year term, which is the amount of time that a president is elected for, and it's 4 years in the United States, he was reelected. And so the people of the United States wanted him to be president again, and so he did. But after that next 4 years, after he had been president for 8 years, he retired. So he didn't want to try to be president for life. Right now, it is a law in the United States that a president can only be elected for 2 terms, which means they can only be president for a total of 8 years. But when the country first started, that was not the case. So President Washington could have easily been president for 8, 12, 16 years, but he really didn't want that. So he actually set a really great example for Americans and for people all over the world that the government could operate successfully with a leader who wasn't a king, and where the people had a say in the government and the Constitution. And he also showed that the Constitution was working. Sasha, you are right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had 4 terms as a president. The law changed after that point. So, and I think part of the reason that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to continue for so long was also that the United States and most of the world was fighting in World War II. And so they felt that it was better to just continue on rather than stop and hold an election. Lorna, I agree, George Washington. I think he was an honest man like Abraham Lincoln. I think he was a really good man. I'm not sure that he was perfect and he never made any mistakes, which it's easy to think about like really great people in history that way. But I do feel that he really honestly tried to do his best all the time. Isaiah, where did he live? Because I think slavery was going on in the South, or in the South and in the North. Yes. So great question, Isaiah. In the beginning of the United States, there was no law anywhere against slavery. Many of the men who helped create the Constitution or had a hand in it, some of them had slaves, many of them had slaves, maybe all of them had slaves. Some of them didn't necessarily like the system. Like I believe George Washington actually freed all of his slaves at some point. And many of the men who were against slavery wanted to put something in the Constitution about slavery, but they weren't sure that it would be the right thing for that country at the time, because the country had just come together. And they needed it to work, and they needed it to continue to grow, and they needed this system to work so that they wouldn't get taken back over by Britain. And so some of those men agreed not to talk about slavery or try to end slavery in the beginning, because the most important thing to them was making this country work and making this experiment work. I agree, slavery is bad. I don't think it's good at all. But they wanted to give the country a chance to actually form. And they sort of all agreed that they would save that problem for a later generation. Okay, Anjali, I'll know that it's you talking, not Isaiah. Thank you for telling me that. Lily, great question. Yes, George Washington was born in Virginia, which is considered to be the South at that time. Okay, so what did I say before this? Sorry, I got a little distracted by the George Washington thing. Okay, good. So the Constitution was working, right? So because the system was working and people were happy with it, the country continued to grow. People from Europe heard the news about this new country where they could have freedom, they could have a say in the government, there wasn't a king, and they flooded in. They wanted to live there. They wanted to live in this new country. And it started getting a little crowded. So they started looking for new land. And there was so much new land to the west that they had gotten from Britain after the war. So can everybody sort of see this yellow area? There was something called the Treaty of Paris. A treaty is an agreement that was made. So the Treaty of Paris was an agreement that was made between the new country, the United States, and England after the Revolutionary War. And so all this yellow land belonged to the new country, the United States. Now, if you're familiar with geography, You can probably recognize some shapes that you know, like the little mitten by the Great Lakes, that's the state of Michigan. You can kind of see where some of the things were. So they won all that land. So this land was called the frontier. And a frontier is a place where people are just beginning to settle, where they're just beginning to live. And it's usually a little bit wild out in the wilderness. You know, there's maybe not a lot of roads, definitely not a lot of people, no towns. There might be Native Americans there, wild animals, all those things. So the Americans started moving into the frontier were called the pioneers. And the pioneers is a name for a group of people who move into a new area to settle. Yes, Lorna, you can see Lake Michigan, that's right. Yes. Daniel Boone, that's right. There's lots of people who moved west and started to settle. Great question, Dean. The 13 colonies had different groups like New England colonies and so on. Did the English own all the colonies? The English did own all of the original 13 colonies. They were kind of arranged in slightly different ways than we know them now, but they were all owned by the British. Yes, they took their dogs. That's right. Everybody, you'd probably want a dog if you moved into the wilderness, I'm thinking, because it could help you with hunting. It could help guard your property because you had to build your own house and all those things. And maybe if you were living by yourself, you might get a little lonesome. So you'd want to have a dog for company. I think I would want a dog for company. So the pioneers, they were moving west. Sorry, just one second, guys. Sorry. They were moving west to find a place to make a home for their families. Of course, the land they were moving into wasn't empty. It was actually home to other people, the Native American Indians. And this is just a picture of some Indians, an Indian tribe, the Cherokee tribe, which were some of them that lived in that area. Oh, Anjali, no problem. What's a pioneer? A pioneer is a person who moves to a new area of land to settle. And so these people were moving from the East Coast to this new land to the west. So there was a lot of space. If you guys remember that yellow section of the map, there was a lot of frontier lands that the Americans had won from the British. And there was room for a lot of people to live there. But as more and more pioneer settlers came looking for a place to raise their families, they started crowding those Native American Indians who were already there on the land. And sometimes they got along well and they could trade, which is a good picture. That's my picture to my right, is a picture of some trading, and they got along well and they were friends. But if you've studied history, you know that that is not only the case. That's not always the case. But other times they fought and they didn't get along well. So if you look back in history, if we look a little bit backwards from before the United States, before the 13 colonies, we can find a lot of examples of new people moving, for whatever reason, moving into areas where other people have already lived. And mostly these new people moving into these areas where people have already lived, it usually ends with killing, with a lot of killing, and with one of the groups of people getting conquered or taken over and becoming very unhappy. So if, you know, we talked a little bit in my first one, we talked a little bit about Christopher Columbus. And if you were here then, you know, he came into an area where there were already people living and wanted to take over that. And that was one of the ones where it ended with a lot of killing and one group being unhappy. Yes, Native American Indians still do exist. and they live everywhere all over the United States. Sometimes they live in certain areas. They're not, like in history, they were required at some points to live in certain areas. But now they are free to live wherever they want. They're an American citizen, and they have the same rights and freedoms as we do. But that was not the case at this time. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that is kind of a bloody picture. And I agree, Anjali, I would prefer no peace. I would prefer peace and no fighting. You are absolutely right. So here's an example that where this is a way that it was not done correctly. So one example takes place about 800 years ago in what's now Mexico, where there were a group of Native Americans, which were called the Aztecs. Maybe you've heard of them. They were fierce warriors, and they moved around, and they would fight, and they would conquer other tribes of Native Americans. They kept expanding their power in this way, and about 700 years later, they were the most powerful empire in North America. So they had a bunch of land. You can see in the picture in the right, they had taken over all that land, but the tribes that they conquered really hated them, and they were very unhappy. Anjali, great question. Native American is just the name for a person who lived in the United States, or their ancestors lived in the United States before the colonists came. Native means coming from that place. And so Native Americans are the Americans who were here before anybody came over from Europe. So around the same time, a different empire developed in South America, and they were called the Incas. And they developed their empire very differently from the Aztecs. So the Aztecs, they conquered, they fought. The people that they took over were very unhappy. So the Incas were different. As they grew, they gave every tribe that they gave a choice to every tribe they came in contact with that they wanted to take over. They said, don't fight us, join us. And if you do, we will make you citizens of our tribe. You can join our tribe and you'll have all the same rights as we do. And they ended up with a very large empire and happy people. So what did they do that was a little bit different? They gave them a chance to join and be part of their group, rather than saying, we're more important than you, we're more powerful, and so we are going to take over you. So instead of taking them over, they really made them part of their group and made them feel welcome. I agree, the Aztecs definitely, I mean, the Incas definitely did, do it better than the Aztecs. And yes, they are bowing to a chief, because even if when you joined the tribe, there was the chief who was kind of the president or the leader of that tribe, and he would tell them what they should do. Hadia, I hope I said your name right. The Incas still do exist, though maybe not necessarily as a tribe altogether, but there are still descendants of Incas who live throughout South America. Okay, so if only in North America, the newcomer Americans, those people moving from the east to the west, and the Native Americans had spent more time studying history, which maybe wouldn't have been possible, but if they had, they could perhaps, the two groups could have taken notes from the good ideas of the Incas and spent more and less time fighting and more time blending into this beautiful common culture. April, what is a tribe? A tribe is a group of Native Americans that are usually under one sort of type of people, descendants of one type of people. And so they're called an Indian tribe. They work together, they live together. Good. So by 1801, more and more new families were arriving in the United States from Europe, wanting to take advantage of the freedom and the space that they had here. And with so many of them decided to become pioneers, and they wanted to settle the frontier areas. And so it was really clear to the United States that they would need new land even further west. They would need to go more westward than they already had. And so solving this problem fell to the president at the time. His name was Thomas Jefferson. Caleb, I saw you raised your hand, but if you want to type your question in the Q&A box, then I will try to answer it. Okay, so I promised we were going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, right? So a little bit, and Holly, I see that you raised your hand too. If you type it into the Q&A box, then I can see what your question is, and then I'll be able to answer it. Sorry, guys. Hold on 1 second. I'm just trying to see. Oh, Caleb, we are going to go until about 11 o'clock my time, which is just about 14 more minutes. And yes, Holly, you're right. That is Thomas Jefferson. So who's Thomas Jefferson? He wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which we talked about a little bit before this. And if that's all he ever did, he would have been remembered as a really great man in history. And not because it's that he said in it that the colonies should be free of Britain, because anybody could have said that, and many people shared that opinion. Do you know what he said that was so new and important? So in the Declaration of Independence, he also said that all men are created equal, and that they're equal in their rights, and that those rights don't come from any king or government, but from their creator or their God, which is what they believed at that time. Many people still do believe that. He said that all are born this way. And because of that, those rights can't be taken away by anyone. He also said that the government is the servant of the people, and not that the people are the servant of the government. And this was a really new idea at that time, and really, really important. So before that idea came about, your rights were given to you by a king, and they could be taken away by the king. And you had to serve the king in his government. So this was a brand new idea. Because of the power and truth of the words that Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, 85 years later, Abraham Lincoln said that today, so at his time and in all the days in the future, that idea would protect people. So that idea that your rights were given to you not by a king, and that they couldn't be taken away by the government, and that the government actually works and serves you. And it continues to do that today. It continues to protect people. But besides that, which still is a really big thing, Jefferson did many other things. Let's see, you guys have a question. Yes, I am on the West Coast. Anjali, Thomas Jefferson actually lived in the South. He was also from Virginia, just like George Washington. And Lorna, great question. I see that John Hancock signed his name a lot bigger than anybody else. Why? I'm not sure exactly why, but he was the first to sign it. So maybe he took up a little bit more room than everybody else. So here's some other interesting things that Thomas Jefferson did. So he started the University of Virginia, He started the University of Virginia because he knew that education was important. He said that all the people in the country should be educated, because only an educated people can properly govern or manage themselves and remain happy and free. Which I really agree with. Obviously, I'm a teacher, so I think education is really important. But the more you know, the more you can make decisions about life. Another thing that Jefferson did was that he wrote a law which would give religious freedom in Virginia where he lived. And religious freedom means that you can practice or believe in any religion that you want to. Or even not a religion if you choose that, but you have that right to make that choice and no one can tell you otherwise. With help from James Madison, the law was passed, so that religious freedom. After that, people in Virginia had freedom to choose which religion they wanted or to choose not to have one at all. And the government couldn't force anyone to believe one way or pay money to any one church if he wanted to. And this idea was actually used in the Constitution and many countries afterwards. Oh, sorry, my little frill fell out. Okay, good. We have just a couple more minutes. So Jefferson did other things as well. In 1801, he was the country's third president, and he had a problem to solve. Where and how to get more land for everyone who was newly arriving. On his map, so if we look at this map, the US owned the yellow, which is all the land, all the way to the Mississippi River. But west of that, in the red or pink, depending on your computer screen, is what France owned. And in history, when countries wanted more land, they usually conquered that land. They took their army, they went in, and they conquered it. They took it over. But not Jefferson. He actually wanted to buy the land from France. At the time, the ruler of France was a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. 12 years before, the French decided they wanted to have a revolution to get freedom like the United States. And so they overthrew their king. They kicked him out and they took over. Napoleon was a general fighting in that war for that new country. But unlike General George Washington, at the end, he didn't retire. Napoleon used his army to take over and make himself emperor and be just like a king. Because of this, the French people, they didn't just lose their freedom, but they lost their lives in a lot of horrible wars that came afterwards. But because he was fighting so many wars, he needed money. So we all know that wars are very expensive. You have to buy a lot of things. So in 1803, President Jefferson offered him $15 million and he took it. So this thing that he bought, anybody who said the Louisiana Purchase was absolutely right. With that $15 million, President Jefferson had doubled the amount of territory that was owned by the United States. He bought all of that land that was in green. So that was the Louisiana Purchase. It was a really great deal. $15 million sounds like a lot of money, but not really when we're talking about this amount of land. So a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson just before we end off. He lived to be 83 years old and he died in 1836 on July 4th, which was Independence Day. And in his long life, he made laws for Virginia. He was the governor of Virginia, which means he ran and managed the state. He was the US minister to France. He went to France and he helped work with them. He was also a vice president and he was a president of the United States. But before he died, he was most proud of three things. And that's what he wanted to be on his gravestone. The author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the law, the Virginia Law for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. Thank you guys so much for joining my webinar. I hope you learned. No, Shayna, I'm not sick. I just was talking a lot and didn't have any water. And so talking for 45 minutes sometimes makes your throat a little dry. I know it happens to me. Yes, Lorna, you're right. He did double the size of the United States. And Anjali, I'm sorry, we made it all the way through the presentation. I wasn't sure we were going to, but we did. Just a reminder, if you guys are interested in studying more of the courses or things like this, you guys could go to heronbooks.com and find out more. Here's an example of one of them. I have one called History and Timelines. I'm glad you guys enjoyed the class. I hope you guys have a great day too. And I will see you tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about Lewis and Clark and some of the exploring that they did do in the land that was the Louisiana Purchase. So I'll see you guys tomorrow.